The rain came down hard the night Adelaide Whitlock lost everything. It was the kind of rain that falls in northern Illinois in late October, when the lake winds sweeps south across the suburbs and the trees give up the last of their gold to the wet ground. The kind of rain that doesn't sting and doesn't roar. It just settles into a person layer by layer until the cold reaches the bone. She stood on the limestone porch of the only home she had ever known. A black garbage bag hung from her right hand. Inside that bag were 3 pairs of jeans, 4 old t-shirts, a thin gray hoodie that had once belonged to her father, and a battered green tackle box she had grabbed off the third shelf of his study at the last possible moment. That was everything she owned in the world. 19 years old, 19 years of memories behind those mahogany doors, 19 Christmases under a tree that nearly touched the second-floor balcony, 19 birthdays around the long farm table in the dining room, 19 Thanksgivings carved off her father's prime rib, all of it sealed shut now behind the brass deadbolt that had just clicked into place behind her. She did not turn around. She would not give them the satisfaction.
Camilla had stood behind the leaded glass of the double doors, draped in a cashmere shawl, the color of bone ash, her dark hair pulled back from a face that had never once in 5 years looked at Addie without calculation. Beside her stood Bennett, 22 years old, fresh out of an Ivy League school that Addie's father had paid for in full. Bennett wore a grin Addie would carry inside her chest for the rest of her life. It was the grin of a boy who had just won something he had never earned. "You are 19, Adelaide," Camilla had said through the crack in the door before she closed it for good. "Legally an adult. Your father is gone. The free ride is over. This house belongs to me now. If you set foot on this property again, I will have you arrested for trespassing." Then the click, the brass deadbolt, the end of childhood. Addie walked down the sweeping driveway under the hammering rain, her sneakers filled with water by the time she reached the iron gates. The estate stretched behind her, $14 million of limestone and slate and dripping lawn, every window of it lit up warm and yellow against the black sky. From the road, it would look like a Christmas card. From the road, it would look like the kind of place where good things happen to good people. She kept walking. Her Honda Civic was parked a quarter-mile down the lane where Camilla had told the security guards to move it 3 days earlier. A 2008 model silver paint, dulled by salt and years, the back bumper held on by a strip of black electrical tape. Her father, Theodore Whitlock, had given her that car on her 16th birthday, not because he could not afford something better, because he believed a young person should earn the right to nicer things. He had told her that night with his big calloused hand on her shoulder that the day she became whatever the hell she wanted to become, he would buy her any car on the road, any car at all. And she had laughed and said she would take an old pickup truck because that was what he drove on the weekends. She climbed into the Civic. The interior smelled like the lavender air freshener she had hung from the rear view the week before his funeral. She set the garbage bag on the passenger seat. She set the green tackle box on top of it. She put her hands on the steering wheel and she sat there. She did not cry. She watched the rain run down the windshield in long silver lines, and she sat there, 19 years old, a quarter tank of gas, $47 in her checking account, and nowhere on the face of this earth to go. She pulled away from the curb at 20 after 8 that night. She drove south on Sheridan Road, past the mansions and the iron fences and the long dark hedges, and she did not look back at the house where her father had raised her. She could not. If she had looked back, she would have stopped the car, and if she had stopped the car, she would have sat there until the police came. So she drove. She was halfway to nowhere when the memory came up out of her like a held breath she had been carrying since the funeral. She was 8 years old, and she was sitting on the deck of her father's old aluminum Lund boat in the middle of Lake Michigan at 4 in the morning. The world was still black. The water was still black, and her father was sitting beside her in a faded brown Carhartt jacket with the green tackle box open between his knees. "You see this Adelaide," he had said. He held up a small lead sinker. He turned it in the light of his headlamp. "You see how heavy this little thing is. It doesn't look like much, but this is what carries your line down to where the fish actually are. Without this little piece of metal, your bait just floats on top, and the fish never see it. Remember that. The most important things are almost never the ones that look important." She had nodded the way children nod when they don't quite understand, but they know the words matter. He had ruffled her hair, and then he had handed her the rod, and they had not spoken again for 40 minutes because Theo Whitlock believed the woods and the water deserved silence. That was the man who had raised her. He had built Whitlock Logistics from a one-room office above a hardware store in Aurora, Illinois, when he was 26 years old. By the time Addie was born, he employed 1,100 people. By the time she was 10, he employed 4,000. He flew commercial. He drove a 15-year-old pickup. He still cut his own grass on Saturday mornings. He believed in two things above all else, and Addie had heard him say both of them so many times she could speak them in her sleep. The first was that money does not change a man, it reveals him. The second was that the people who hurt you the worst will always be the ones you trusted enough to let close. He should have listened to his own second rule. Camilla had come into his life 5 years ago. She was 41, a corporate consultant who had been hired to streamline the company's Eastern distribution network. She was beautiful in the cold way certain women are beautiful, the way ice is beautiful, the way a marble statue is beautiful. She had a son, Bennett, who was 17 at the time, and she made a great show of trying to mother Addie too in the early days. Addie had wanted to like her. Addie had tried. But every time Camilla hugged her, Addie had felt the woman counting something behind her back. Her father had married Camilla within 11 months. He had told Addie the night before the wedding that he knew she was uncertain and that he was uncertain too, but that a man cannot live alone forever, and that her mother had been gone now for 9 years, and that he was tired of eating dinner across an empty table. He had asked her to give Camilla a chance. He had asked her to trust him. She had trusted him. Of course she had trusted him. He was her father. And 6 months ago, he had died. Massive coronary failure. That was what the doctors had called it. He was 56 years old. He had passed his physical 4 months earlier with the heart of a man 20 years younger. The cardiologist had told Addie in the hallway of Lake Forest Hospital with his hand on her shoulder that he could not explain it. He had said the words, "I'm sorry," 7 times in 5 minutes. He had said it didn't make sense. It didn't make sense. None of it had made sense. But the worst thing, the thing that had broken her in half, had not been the death. The worst thing had been 3 weeks later, the reading of the will, the room she could still see now driving south through the October rain, every wood-paneled inch of it burned into her memory like a brand. Harrison Pemberton had been her father's lawyer for 22 years. He had come to every birthday party since she was 4 years old. He had eaten Thanksgiving dinner at their table for a decade. He had taught her how to ride a bicycle in the driveway one summer when her father was traveling. She had called him Uncle Harry until she was 13. He was a tall man, silver-haired and slow-voiced with the kind of warm, crinkled eyes that made people instinctively trust him. The day of the will reading, Harrison Pemberton would not look her in the eye. He sat behind her father's old oak desk in the study, and he stared down at his yellow legal pad, and he said the words in a voice she did not recognize. He said that Theodore Whitlock had revised his will 3 weeks before his death. He said that the new will, signed and witnessed and notarized, left everything to Camilla: the company, the real estate, the liquid assets, the offshore accounts, everything. Adelaide, the lawyer, had said, finally looking up at her with eyes that were wet and shaking, had been left a one-time payout of $10,000. $10,000. She had stared at him. She had waited for him to laugh or to take it back or to tell her there had been a clerical error. She had waited for him to be Uncle Harry. He had not been Uncle Harry. He had been a stranger in a $1,000 suit, and he had folded up the yellow legal pad, and he had walked out of the study without saying goodbye. The $10,000, Camilla had told her later, was tied up in probate. It might take some time to release. She was very sorry. Addie had moved into the guest house that night. She had cried for 3 days, and then she had slowly, painfully started to understand that something was very wrong. It was not just the money. It was the way Camilla had been waiting, the way the new will had appeared like a magic trick, the way Harrison Pemberton, a man who had once carried her on his shoulders at a 4th of July picnic, could not bring himself to look at her face. It was the way Bennett had moved into her father's master bedroom within 48 hours of the funeral, the way the locks on the wine cellar and the gun safe were changed inside a week, the way every member of the household staff who had worked for her father longer than 3 years was quietly let go. She had wanted to fight. She had wanted to hire a lawyer of her own, but she was 19. She had no money. She had no relatives. Her mother's family had cut ties 2 generations earlier, and her father had been an only child. There was no one. There was just her and the guest house, and a growing cold dread that something was rotten in the heart of her own home. That had lasted 6 months, until tonight, until Camilla had decided the guest house was needed for renovation and had given her 30 minutes to pack a bag and leave. So now she drove through Lake Forest and into Highland Park, past the closed boutiques and the dark restaurants and the long, quiet streets of houses where behind every lit window someone she did not know was sitting down to a dinner that was not hers. The wipers slapped time across the windshield. The defroster fought a losing war against the cold breath on the glass. She did not know where she was going. She had no friends close enough to call at 9 at night. She had a few high school acquaintances who had drifted away after her father got rich and the others got jealous. She had a community college boyfriend named Trent who had broken up with her 2 weeks after the funeral because he said she was different now. She was sad all the time, and he could not be around sad all the time. She had no one. She pulled into the parking lot of the Walmart Supercenter off the Edens Expressway just after 10 o'clock. The lot was a third full. The sodium lamps threw long orange pools of light across the wet asphalt. A lone shopping cart rolled slowly across the empty stretch by the garden center, pushed by the wind. She picked a spot in the far back corner beside a chain-link fence and a row of dumpsters. She killed the engine. She locked the doors. She climbed into the back seat with her father's gray hoodie pulled tight around her, and she pressed her face into the fabric, and for the first time since the brass deadbolt had clicked, she let herself cry. She cried for a long time. When she finally stopped, the rain was still coming down. The clock on the dashboard read 11:47. The temperature outside was 41 degrees. She was 19 years old. She had $47 in her checking account, and her father, the strongest man she had ever known, was buried 6 feet under the cold ground of Memorial Park Cemetery in Lake Bluff, and there was no one left in the world who would come looking for her if she disappeared tonight. That was the first night. The second night, she ate a package of saltine crackers and a jar of peanut butter she had bought at the Walmart for $3.79. The third night, the temperature dropped to 36, and she sat with the engine running and the heater on for as long as she dared until the gas needle ticked down past a quarter and she had to shut it off. The fourth night, she rationed the crackers and stretched the peanut butter and learned that a person can sleep in a Honda Civic if she folds the passenger seat forward and lays diagonally across the back and the passenger floor with her father's hoodie balled up under her head as a pillow. The fifth night, she moved to a different Walmart. She had heard from another woman in the truck stop bathroom off I-294 that the corporate policy allowed overnight parking, but that individual store managers could call the police if they noticed the same vehicle 2 nights running. She did not want the police. She did not want anyone to know. She rotated between 3 Walmarts, Old Orchard, Skokie, Niles. She would shower in the $1.50 truck stop, showers off I-294, the ones the long-haul drivers used with their long lines of men in flannel shirts, smelling of diesel and their stalls floored in cracked beige tile. She would eat dollar menu hamburgers when she could afford them and crackers when she could not. She would sit in the parking lot for hours, watching families with shopping carts roll out into the lot, watching mothers buckle their toddlers into car seats, watching fathers carry sleeping children with their heads on their shoulders, and she would think about her own father, and she would think about the green tackle box on the passenger seat, and she would not open it. She could not open it. She did not know why. It was the smell, she thought sometimes, when she could think clearly about it. The smell that would come out of that box, if she opened it, would be the smell of every father-daughter morning of her childhood, the smell of stale lake water and old rubber worms and bait grease and rusted metal hooks. And once that smell got out of the box and into the cabin of the Honda Civic, she would not survive it. She would dissolve. She would melt into the floor mats. She would never put herself back together, so she let the box sit silent and unopened on the passenger floor. In the second week, the wind shifted out of the north and the nights began to drop into the 30s and the high 20s. She woke up one morning with frost on the inside of her own breath on the windows. She started the engine to warm the cabin, and the gas needle was already at 1/8 of a tank. She sat in the driver's seat in her father's hoodie and a thin black peacoat she had bought for $7 at a Salvation Army on Dempster, and she stared at the gas needle, and she thought very quietly and very clearly that she might be about to die. Not soon, not tonight, but soon enough. The winter was coming. She had no income. She had no plan. She was burning through her $47 at a rate of about $6 a day. She had maybe 12 days left before the money ran out completely, and then she would not have gas, and she would not have food, and she would not have a way to keep the cabin warm at night. She thought about going back to the estate. She thought about begging Camilla. She thought about it for a long time, and then she thought about Bennett's grin behind the leaded glass, and she put that thought away forever. She thought about going to the police. She thought about telling them what had happened, but her father's last lawyer had been Harrison Pemberton, and Harrison Pemberton had been the one to read the will, and the will had been legal, and she was just a 19-year-old girl with no money and no proof of anything. The police would tell her to hire a probate attorney. A probate attorney would charge her $10,000. She did not have to start a case she could not win. She was alone. She had been alone for 6 months, and she had not understood it because Camilla had still been pretending and Bennett had still been pretending. But now Camilla had stopped pretending and Bennett had stopped pretending, and Addie understood for the first time what alone actually meant. It meant that she could die in this parking lot and no one would notice, and the manager of the Walmart would have her car towed in 3 days, and the city of Skokie would store the car for 30 days, and after 30 days the city would sell the car at auction for $200, and her body, if anyone bothered to claim, it would be cremated and put in a small cardboard box in a state warehouse, and there would not be a funeral, and there would not be a headstone, and there would not even be a name on the warehouse box, just a case number. That was what alone meant. It was on the 13th day that she met Eleanor Thornberry. Addie was sitting at a picnic table outside the Niles Walmart, eating a banana that had gone soft at one end when an older woman walked over with a paper cup of black coffee from the McDonald's across the parking lot and sat down across from her without being invited. The woman was maybe 65, maybe older. Her hair was iron gray and tied back in a long braid. She wore a forest green wool coat that was 3 sizes too big and held shut with a piece of brown jute twine. Her boots were men's work boots, the leather cracked and re-waxed many times. Her face was the color of weathered cedar. Her eyes were a startling clear blue, and they took in Addie's whole situation in about 2 seconds. "That hoodie's too thin," the woman said. Her voice was low and steady, like someone who had been a teacher once, like someone who had read aloud to children for many years. "You need a layer of fleece between cotton and skin." "You got a fleece?" Addie just looked at her. "Eleanor Thornberry," the woman said, and she did not extend a hand. "Most folks call me Miss Nellie. I have been sleeping in my Buick over by the Home Depot for going on 3 years now. I am not asking you for anything. I just saw a young thing alone at a picnic table at 9 in the morning in this cold, and I thought I would come over and say hello." Addie tried to say her own name. The word came out as a whisper. "I cannot hear you, sweetheart," Miss Nellie said gently. "Take a breath. Try again." "Adelaide," she said. "People call me Addie." Miss Nellie nodded. She wrapped her old leathery hands around the McDonald's cup. She blew on the coffee. She did not ask Addie how she had ended up at this picnic table. She did not ask her where her family was. She did not ask any of the questions a person would normally ask, and Addie understood watching her that Miss Nellie was a woman who knew how shame worked, knew that a person who had lost everything could not stand to be asked about it, could only stand to be sat with. They sat together at the picnic table for nearly an hour. Miss Nellie talked about nothing in particular. She talked about a cardinal she had seen on the dumpster behind the McDonald's 3 mornings in a row. She talked about a teacher she had worked with 30 years ago at a high school in Rockford who used to claim he could predict the first frost of the year by counting the woolly bear caterpillars on the road. She talked about her late husband, Walter, who had been a route driver for a bread company for 31 years and who had died of a stroke at the kitchen table 6 years ago last March. She talked about how she had lost the house 18 months after that, how the medical bills and the back taxes had taken it, how she still drove past it sometimes. There was a woman who bought the house, Miss Nellie said, looking down into her coffee cup. She painted the front door yellow. Walter would have hated that. He thought yellow doors were for diners. But the woman has small children, and the children have a tire swing in the front yard now, and you cannot stay angry at a house with a tire swing in the front yard, so I do not stay angry. I drive past, and I look at the tire swing, and I keep going. Addie listened. She did not say much. She listened. Miss Nellie talked about how the first week in the Buick had been the worst, how she had not slept for 4 days, how she had finally fallen asleep in the parking lot of a Catholic church in Wheeling on the 5th day, and how the priest had come out and tapped on her window at 7 in the morning, and how she had been certain he was going to tell her to leave, and how instead he had handed her a thermos of soup and a hand-knit blue scarf one of his parishioners had made for the poor, and he had told her she could stay there as long as she needed, and that the rectory had a bathroom she could use until 8 in the evening. She still had the scarf. She still had the thermos. She had stopped going to the church only when the priest got transferred to a parish in Joliet 2 years later, and she had not had the heart to introduce herself to the new one. Addie listened to all of it. She did not say much, but somewhere in the middle of Miss Nellie's story about the priest with the soup, she started to cry very quietly, just water running down her face that she did not bother to wipe away. Miss Nellie did not mention the tears. She just kept talking in that low, steady voice until the tears stopped. When Miss Nellie finally stood up, she reached into the deep pocket of her green coat and she pulled out a folded gray fleece blanket the size of a dinner plate. She set it on the picnic table. "That goes between you and the seat at night," she said. "Cotton on cotton doesn't trap any heat. You put a layer of fleece down, you can drop 10 degrees and you will still sleep." "Old trick," Miss Nellie Addie said. The woman waited. "I cannot," Addie said. "You need this." "I have got another one in the Buick," Miss Nellie said. "Take it." Addie took it. She did not have the strength to refuse. Miss Nellie stood there for a moment, looking down at her in the cold gray morning light, with her cracked work boots and her braid and her clear blue eyes, and then she said the thing that 4 days later would save Adelaide Whitlock's life. She said, "Your daddy didn't raise you to die in a car, sweetheart. Whatever it is he left you, you have not opened it yet. You will know when you have, and when you do, you take it apart piece by piece. Look at the bottom of everything. Look behind everything. Old men like your daddy, they don't leave their daughters with nothing. They just leave them with things that are not in the obvious place." Addie stared at her. She had not told Miss Nellie about her father. She had not told her anything. Miss Nellie shrugged, the way old people shrug at coincidences. She did not seem to think she had said anything strange. She picked up her McDonald's cup and she said, "You take care of yourself, Adelaide." And she walked off across the parking lot toward an old maroon Buick LeSabre parked in the shadow of the Home Depot. Addie sat at the picnic table for a long time after she was gone. She drove back to her own Walmart that afternoon. She parked in the back corner by the dumpsters. She climbed into the back seat. She pulled the green tackle box from where it had been sitting on the floor for 13 days untouched, and she set it on her lap. Old men like your daddy, they don't leave their daughters with nothing. She unlatched the rusted metal clasp. The hinges gave with a small, dry creak. The smell that came up out of that box was the smell of her entire childhood. Lake water, cut grass, the faint chemical sweetness of old rubber worms, the cold tang of rusted hooks. She had to close her eyes for a moment. The interior was just what she had expected. 3 plastic compartment trays stacked on top of each other. Tangles of monofilament line, a small collection of lures, mostly Mepps spinners and Rapala minnows, their hooks dulled and pitted from years of use, a handful of lead sinkers in the corner compartment, her father's old multi-tool with the black rubber grip worn smooth. She lifted the trays out one by one. She set them on the seat beside her. The bottom of the tackle box was a sheet of green plastic. It looked like nothing. It looked like the molded base of every tackle box ever made. Addie ran her fingers across it. It felt solid. It felt like one piece. She remembered what Miss Nellie had said. Look at the bottom of everything. She pressed down on the plastic in the corner. Nothing. She pressed in the middle. Nothing. She pressed in the opposite corner. There was a soft, almost inaudible click. Adelaide Whitlock stopped breathing. She pressed again. The plastic shifted under her thumb. There was a thin seam she had not seen before, running along 3 sides of the rectangle, a seam that had been disguised by the molded ridges of the bottom panel. She slipped her father's old multi-tool blade under the edge. She pried. The false bottom lifted out in her hand. Underneath was a shallow compartment, maybe 3 inches deep. Inside that compartment, resting on the dark green plastic of the true floor, were 2 things: a small black velvet pouch, the size of a deck of cards, and a folded piece of yellow legal paper that had her father's handwriting on the outside. The handwriting said simply, Adelaide. She could not move for a full minute. She picked up the paper first. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to set the tackle box down on the seat and use both of them. She unfolded the page. It was her father's handwriting. There was no question. The slanted, hurried scrawl of a man who had grown up filling out shipping manifests by hand. But it was also not his handwriting, not quite. It was thinner. The letters wandered. There were places where the pen had dug too deep into the paper and other places where it had skipped. It was the handwriting of a man who was sick, or scared, or both. Bertie, the note began, and Addie made a small, involuntary sound, because Bertie was what her father had called her since the morning she was 3 years old. He had called her that since a morning in early May, when a small chickadee had landed on her shoulder in the backyard and would not fly off no matter how she laughed and turned her head, and her father had said she must be a bird whisperer, and that from that day forward she was his Bertie, and she always would be. No one else on earth had ever called her that. Not her mother before her mother had died, not her teachers in school, not the boys she had dated, just her father, just Theo Whitlock, and his daughter, and a small chickadee from 16 years ago. Bertie, if you are reading this, the worst has happened. They have moved on you. I am sorry. I am so sorry. I should have moved first. Listen to me carefully, because I am running out of time and my head is not clear most days now. Camilla is not what she says she is. Bennett is worse. Do not trust Harrison Pemberton. He has been with them for 2 years at least, probably longer. They are forging documents. They are working on the company from the inside. My medication is doing something to me. My head is foggy on the days I take it. I am clear on the days I forget. I know how that sounds. I know. I cannot leave you anything on paper, Bertie. They are watching the paper. Anything I leave you in the will, they will take. Anything I leave you in the safe, they will find. So I am leaving you something they cannot see. Go to the First National Bank downtown. Box 402. Use what is in the pouch. The key inside that pouch will open a door I have built for you. There is a place I have built for you that they do not know exists. Go there. Take everything inside. Do not stop. Do not call the police in Lake Forest. Do not call anyone you knew through me. I love you, Bertie. I love you. I love you. I am sorry. Look up. Dad. Addie read it 3 times. The 3rd time, she set the page very carefully on her lap and she opened the small black velvet pouch. A single object slid out into her palm. It was a silver key, long, sleek, professionally machined, with a small 4-digit number etched into the bow, 402. She closed her hand around it. For the first time in 6 months, Adelaide Whitlock began to understand that her father had not abandoned her. He had been murdered. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the back of the Honda Civic with the gray fleece blanket from Miss Nellie wrapped around her shoulders, and she read the letter again and again and again until the words went up into her brain and burned themselves into the inside of her skull. They have been with them for 2 years at least. They are forging documents. My medication is doing something to me. Do not trust Harrison Pemberton. Every detail of the last 6 months came back to her now in a different light. The way Camilla had insisted on a private home nurse for her father 6 months before he died. The way the nurse, a woman named Beverly, something had been the one who refilled his pill bottles every other week from a small briefcase she carried locked at all times. The way Bennett had started coming home from college on weekends, he had never come home before sitting in her father's study with him at all hours, going over things that Bennett had no business going over. The way Harrison Pemberton had started arriving at the house unannounced with manila folders under his arm, and her father had started looking tired in a way that was not normal, tired in a way that was deep and gray and confused. He had been confused. That was what she remembered now. In the last 3 months of his life, he had begun to forget things he should not have forgotten. He had forgotten Addie's birthday on a Tuesday in March, and then he had called her the next morning in a panic, saying he could not believe he had forgotten that he was getting old, that the medication was making him fuzzy. He had forgotten a meeting with one of the company's biggest clients in Atlanta and had to take the late flight down to apologize in person. He had forgotten where he had put his car keys 3 times in 1 week. He had laughed about it at the time. He had laughed. He had not been getting old. He had been getting poisoned. The next morning she drove downtown. She had filled the tank with 17 of her remaining $31, and she had washed her face in the truck stop bathroom off I-294, and she had pulled her hair back into a tight ponytail, and she had put on the cleanest shirt she had, which was a black long sleeve from a high school choir trip 3 years ago. She did not look like a person who belonged in the First National Bank of Chicago. She knew that. She tried not to think about it. The bank was a marble cathedral. The lobby ceiling rose 3 stories above her head, brass railings, polished oak counters, the hush of money. A security guard at the door watched her come in with the eyes of a man who had been trained to identify problems before they happened. She walked to the customer service desk. A woman in a gray suit looked up at her with a polite, controlled smile. "I need to access a safe deposit box," Addie said. Her voice was quieter than she meant it to be. She cleared her throat. "I have a key." The woman's smile did not change, but something behind her eyes did. "May I see some identification?" the woman said. Addie set her driver's license on the counter. She set the silver key beside it. The woman picked up the key. She looked at the number etched on the bow. She looked at the license. She looked at Addie. And then, without saying anything, she picked up a phone behind the counter and she made a brief call in a voice too quiet to hear. Addie's heart was hammering against the inside of her ribs. A man in a darker gray suit appeared from a side hallway less than 2 minutes later. He was middle-aged, balding, with the round, soft face of a banker. He introduced himself as Mr. Cardiff. He smiled in a way that did not reach his eyes. He led her through a hallway, through a heavy door, into a small windowless room with a long oak table and 2 leather chairs and a brushed steel cart standing against the wall. "The box is being retrieved now," Mr. Cardiff said. He had not stopped smiling. He set a clipboard on the table and asked her to sign in 3 places. She signed. He took the clipboard back. He told her she could have as much time as she needed. He left and closed the door behind him. 2 minutes later, he returned wheeling the brushed steel cart. On the cart sat a long, flat metal box. He lifted the box and set it on the oak table with both hands. He nodded to her professional and final, and he left again, and the door clicked shut, and Adelaide Whitlock was alone with whatever her father had left her. She sat down. She stared at the metal box for a long time. Then she opened it. There was no stack of cash. There were no gold bars. There were no diamonds. There was only a single manila folder tied shut with a thin loop of brown string. She untied the string. She opened the folder. The first document inside was a property deed. It was registered to a shell company called Blue Heron Holdings, LLC. The property was a parcel of land and a residential structure in a place called Black River Falls, Wisconsin. Addie had never heard of Black River Falls. She had never heard her father mention Wisconsin in her entire life, except once or twice as a place he had driven through as a young man on his way to fish in Minnesota. The second document, paper-clipped to the first, was a notarized declaration that the sole proprietor of Blue Heron Holdings, LLC, the only human being on planet Earth with any legal claim to the company's assets, was Adelaide Margaret Whitlock. She read the declaration 4 times before she fully understood it. Her father had set up a shell company. He had bought a piece of property under that shell company, and he had put her name on the company in such a way that the property would never appear in any personal estate, would never be subject to probate, would never show up if Camilla or Harrison Pemberton or Bennett searched his name in any database in the country. Her father had hidden a house for her. There was a third item in the folder, a small brass key taped to the inside of the folder cover with a strip of yellowed masking tape. On the masking tape in her father's slanted, hurried hand were 2 words, front door. Addie sat in the small windowless room in the marble cathedral of the First National Bank of Chicago, and she held that brass key in her right hand, and she held the silver safe deposit key in her left hand, and she understood finally and completely what her father had spent the last months of his life doing. He had built her an escape route. He had built her a hidden door. He had known he was dying, and he had spent his last clear hours making sure that when the worst came, she would have somewhere to go. She pressed the keys against her chest, and she bent forward at the waist, and she made a sound that was not crying and not laughing and not anything she had a word for. Then she sat up. She wiped her face. She tied the brown string back around the folder. She put the folder in her hoodie pocket. She put both keys in the front pocket of her jeans. She closed the empty metal box. She walked out of the small, windowless room. She nodded to Mr. Cardiff with the round, soft face and the smile that did not reach his eyes. She walked across the marble lobby and out the heavy bronze door and into the gray October light of downtown Chicago. She walked 3 blocks to where she had parked the Honda Civic. She sat in the driver's seat. She put both hands on the wheel, and for the first time in 6 months, Adelaide Whitlock had a destination. Black River Falls, Wisconsin, 5 hours northwest, up I-94 to the Wisconsin border, then west on Highway 12, then north on county roads that would get smaller and smaller until they were no longer paved. She did not have much. She had $11 in her checking account after the gas. She had a tank of fuel. She had a loaf of bread and a jar of generic peanut butter from the Walmart. She had her father's gray hoodie and Miss Nellie's gray fleece blanket. She had a green tackle box with a false bottom that her father had built with his own hands. She had 2 keys. She had a destination. It was enough. She pulled out of the parking spot a little after 1 in the afternoon. The sky over Chicago was the color of an old nickel. The rain had stopped sometime in the morning, but the streets were still slick. She took Roosevelt Road west to the on-ramp for I-90, and she merged onto the interstate, and she pointed the nose of the Honda Civic toward the north. It was somewhere outside Rockford, on the open stretch, where the cornfields go flat to the horizon, on either side of the highway, that she first noticed the black SUV. It was 3 car lengths back, a late model Chevy Suburban with windows tinted so dark they looked like polished obsidian. She would not have noticed it at all, except that when she had taken the previous exit for gas and a bathroom, the black Suburban had taken the exit too, had hung back in the gas station parking lot for a few minutes without filling up, and had merged back onto the interstate behind her. She told herself she was imagining things. She was tired. She was scared. She was reading her father's words in her head every 2 minutes, and the words were making her see threats where there were none. There were 1,000 black Suburbans in northern Illinois. There were 10,000. It was a coincidence. She drove another 20 miles. The Suburban stayed 3 car lengths back. She moved into the left lane. The Suburban moved into the left lane. She moved back into the right. The Suburban moved back into the right, but slower this time, as if its driver had remembered that he was supposed to be subtle. Her hands were tight on the wheel now. The blood was loud in her ears. She took the next exit. It was an exit for a small town called Beloit, just south of the Wisconsin border. The Suburban took the exit. She pulled into the parking lot of a Quick Trip gas station. The Suburban did not pull in. The Suburban drove on past slowly, and she got a clear look at the driver as it went by. She did not know him. She had never seen him before in her life. He was a large man, mid-40s, with a heavy jaw and a buzz cut and the kind of neck that came from lifting weights professionally. He did not look at her as he passed. He looked straight ahead, but she could see even through the tinted glass that his right hand was wrapped around something resting in his lap, something dark and rectangular, something that she did not want to think too hard about. The Suburban turned right at the light past the Quick Trip and disappeared down a county road. Addie sat in the gas station parking lot with the engine running and her hands shaking on the wheel. They had found her father's bank. They had been watching the bank. They had picked her up the moment she walked out, and they had followed her halfway to the Wisconsin border, and the only reason she was not currently being pulled out of her car at a stoplight in some empty cornfield town was that the man with the buzz cut had been waiting for her to lead him somewhere, waiting for her to take him to whatever it was her father had hidden. He did not know about Black River Falls, not yet. If he knew, he would already be there. But he was going to find out, and when he found out, he was going to get there before her, or he was going to be right behind her when she arrived. Addie put the Honda Civic in reverse. She backed out of the Quick Trip parking lot. She did not get back on the interstate. She drove 3 miles east on the county road, then north on a smaller county road, then west again on a state highway she had never heard of. She watched her rearview mirror every 15 seconds. She did not see the Suburban again, but she did not see it the way a hunter does not see the bear in the woods. She did not see it, but she knew it was out there. She knew it was looking. She knew that her father, in the last clear hours of his life, had built her a hidden door in the middle of a Wisconsin forest, and that someone very dangerous was now trying very hard to find that door before she did. She drove through the afternoon and into the evening. The cornfields gave way to dairy farms. The dairy farms gave way to scrub pine and stands of bare oak. The sky went from gray to bronze to purple to black. By the time she crossed the Wisconsin border on a 2-lane state road, the temperature outside had dropped below freezing, and a thin spit of snow was beginning to blow across her windshield. She did not stop. She did not eat. She did not turn on the radio. She drove with both hands on the wheel and her father's letter folded in her pocket, and the 2 keys in the cup holder where she could reach them in a single motion, and she drove north into the deep woods of central Wisconsin toward a town she had never heard of, and a house she had never seen, and a future her father had spent his dying months trying to build for her in the dark. Look up, the letter had said. Look up. She did not yet know what those 2 words meant, but she would. In a little under 24 hours, in a freezing attic above a dilapidated A-frame farmhouse in the middle of a clearing in the Wisconsin pines, she would find out exactly what her father had meant by those 2 small words, and the world she thought she had lost would begin very slowly to come back to her. The road into Black River Falls did not show up on her GPS until she was already on it. She had pulled off the state highway sometime after 8 in the evening on the strength of a single brown wooden sign with the name of the town routed into it in white paint. The sign was leaning. The post was rotted at the base. The road behind it was a single lane of cracked asphalt that wound between walls of black pine, so tall and so close that the trunks brushed against the side mirrors of the Honda Civic when the road curved hard. The headlights cut a narrow yellow tunnel through the falling snow. There were no other cars. There had not been another car for 40 minutes. She drove with the green tackle box on the passenger seat and her father's letter folded inside the cover of the manila folder, and she drove with the speedometer holding steady at 28 miles an hour because the deer up here came out of the trees like ghosts. Twice she had to brake hard, the back end of the Civic fishtailing on the slick blacktop, while a white-tailed doe or a young buck the size of a pony picked its way across the road in front of her and vanished back into the dark. The town itself, when she finally reached it, was barely a town. A volunteer fire station, a boarded-up diner with a Ham's beer sign still glowing in the front window, a small white clapboard church with a tarp over half the roof, a single gas station with 2 pumps, one of which had been bagged with a plastic hood and a sign that said, "Out of order," for what looked like a very long time. The man behind the counter of the gas station did not look up from his newspaper when she walked in to pay cash for $9 of regular. He did not look up when she walked back out. She had the strong sense that he had been not looking up at strangers for 40 years and that he was very, very good at it. The address her father had hidden inside the manila folder was not in town. It was 8 miles further north on a road called Whitetail Creek Lane, which according to her GPS did not exist. She drove out past the dead diner and the boarded-up church and the last sodium streetlight, and the road got narrower and the snow got heavier and the trees got taller, and she watched the trip odometer click off 1 mile and then another and then another. At 7.5 miles, she saw an unmarked dirt logging road branching off to the left between 2 enormous white pines. There was no sign. There was no mailbox. There was nothing but a pair of frost-cracked tire ruts disappearing into the dark. She turned in. The Honda Civic was not built for this. She knew that the moment the front tires dropped into the first deep rut, The whole car bottomed out with a hard metallic crack, and she gritted her teeth and kept her foot on the gas, because if she stopped here in the middle of an unmarked logging road in the Wisconsin woods at 9 at night with snow falling, she was not going to start the car again. The branches of overgrown oaks scraped against the windshield like bone fingers. A small animal she did not see ran across her headlights in a brown streak. She drove for 3 more miles. The road bent left, then right, then left again. Her arms ached from gripping the wheel. The heater was running full blast, and the inside of the windshield kept fogging at the corners. She wiped it with the sleeve of her father's gray hoodie. She wiped it again, and then all at once the trees broke. The clearing opened in front of her like a held breath finally let out. It was maybe an acre of flat ground, the long grass and dead wildflowers, now half flattened under the first snow of the year. In the center of the clearing, slumped under the falling flakes like an old man on a bench, stood a 2-story A-frame farmhouse. She killed the engine. She turned off the headlights. She sat in the silence of the deep woods, and she looked at the house her father had hidden for her, and her heart sank slowly into her stomach. It was a wreck. The white clapboard siding had peeled away in long curled strips, leaving bare gray wood underneath. One of the downstairs windows had been boarded up with a sheet of plywood that itself was now warped and splitting. The porch roof sagged in the middle, dipping down on the left side, as if the house were tired of holding itself up. The front gutter had fallen off entirely and lay rusted in the brown grass beside the steps. A single bare light bulb hung from a bracket beside the front door, dark, the wires dangling from a broken fixture. This was the safe place. This was what her father had been protecting. For a long moment, Addie thought with a cold, sick certainty that something had gone wrong with her father's mind in the last months of his life, that the heart medication had not just poisoned his body, but had clouded his head, that this whole journey had been chasing the broken dream of a sick man, and that there was nothing inside the rotting walls of this Wisconsin farmhouse but mice and raccoon scat and the wind in the rafters. Then she remembered the black Suburban. She remembered the man with the buzz cut. She remembered her father's handwriting trembling on the yellow page. They are forging documents. They are watching the paper. Anything I leave you on paper, they will take. He had been clear-headed enough to outwit them. He had been clear-headed enough to build her a hidden door. She climbed out of the car. The cold hit her in the lungs. The snow was coming sideways now, thin dry flakes that did not stick to her hair, but blew through it like sand. She walked across the brown grass to the steps. The porch boards groaned under her weight, and she half expected one of them to plunge through to the dirt below, but they held. She crossed to the front door. The brass key her father had hidden at the bank slid into the deadbolt. She turned it. It was stiff. It was very stiff. She put her shoulder into it. The deadbolt clicked back with a heavy, satisfying thunk. She pushed the door open. The smell came out of the dark hall to meet her. Mildew, old wood, the sweet rotted scent of mouse droppings, the dry papery smell of empty cabinets and dust. It was not the smell of a place anyone had lived in for many years. She stood on the threshold with her hand on the door frame, and she pulled out the cheap LED flashlight she had bought at the Walmart for $3.99, and she clicked it on, and she shone the beam into the room ahead of her. The living room was a museum, furniture covered in white canvas sheets, yellowed by years to the color of old teeth, a stone fireplace with a cold pile of ash still in the grate, a scarred wood floor, a long built-in bookshelf, empty, the shelves coated in fine gray dust. The dust was the thing that struck her first. It lay across the floor like a coat of paint, a perfect unbroken coat of gray, almost perfect. She took a step inside. She took another. Her own sneaker prints made small, shallow tread marks in the dust behind her where the rubber compressed the powder against the boards. She looked at her own prints. Then she looked deeper into the room, and she froze. Cutting straight across the living room floor from the hallway on the right to the kitchen doorway on the left was a line of boot prints. They were not her boot prints. They were almost twice as long as her sneaker treads. The lugs were deep and sharply defined, the pattern unmistakable. They were the prints of heavy tactical boots, the kind a soldier might wear, the kind a private contractor might wear, the kind a man who was paid to break into houses might wear. And the edges of the displaced dust around each print were sharp, not softened, not blurred by air or time, sharp. Someone had walked across this floor in the last few days. For a long moment, Adelaide Whitlock did not breathe. She did not move. She listened to the house. She listened past the wind in the trees outside, past the small creaks of the old timber settling in the cold, past the dry tick of a wall clock, somewhere that should have been dead and was somehow still running. She listened for breathing. She listened for a footstep above her head. She listened for any human sound at all. The house was silent, but someone had been here, and someone might come back. She reached into her jacket pocket, and her hand closed around her car keys. She threaded them between her knuckles, the way her father had once taught her on a rainy night in a Walmart parking lot when she was 14 after a man in a dirty Chevy had followed her too long. He had told her with his big hand on her shoulder that a key between the knuckles was not a real weapon, but that it was an attitude, and that an attitude was sometimes enough. She walked forward, slowly, deliberately, following the boot prints with her flashlight beam. The prints led across the living room and into the hallway. The hallway was narrow and lined with framed photographs that had been taken down and turned face to the wall. She did not stop to look. She would look later. The prints led past the hallway and into a small room on the right that had once been a study. The study was the room where the intruder had spent the most time. She could see that immediately. A heavy oak desk stood against the far wall. The canvas sheet that had once covered it, now ripped off and flung onto the floor. Every drawer of the desk had been pulled out. Papers were scattered across the wood floor, yellowed insurance forms, an old Wisconsin DMV registration, a few brittle envelopes with no addresses on them. A bookshelf to the right of the desk had been pulled away from the wall, and the books that had once stood on it now lay in a heap on the floor, as if someone had been looking for a hidden safe behind the shelf. There was none. The intruder had searched, and the intruder had been frustrated. That was what Addie understood standing in that doorway with her flashlight in one hand and her keys in the other. If he had found what he was looking for, he would not have left the room destroyed like this. He would have taken what he came for, and he would have closed the drawers behind him, and he would have wiped his prints, and he would have gone, because a professional cleans up. A frustrated man does not. A frustrated man leaves a mess, and the man who had walked through this house had left a mess. He had searched the study. He had searched downstairs. He had not found it. Whatever it was still here. The boot prints came back out of the study and turned toward the staircase. Addie followed them. Her father's words ran through her head on a loop. Look up. The staircase was narrow and steep. The banister was loose under her left hand. The steps creaked badly, one of them so loudly she winced and held her breath for a full 10 seconds, afterward listening for any answering sound from above. None came. The second floor had a small bathroom and a single master bedroom. The bathroom door stood open. The bedroom door was ajar. The boot prints went into the bedroom, paced the length of the bedroom, twice stopped at the open door of a walk-in closet, paced inside the closet, and then came back out and went down the stairs. The intruder had stood in that closet, and he had not seen what was above his head. Addie walked into the master bedroom. There was a stripped mattress on the floor in the corner. There was no other furniture. The walls had once been papered in a faded blue floral pattern that had now mostly peeled. She walked past the mattress and into the walk-in closet. It was an ordinary closet, maybe 6 feet deep and 5 feet wide. A row of empty wire hangers on a steel rod, a built-in wooden shelf along the back wall about 4 feet off the ground. The ceiling was paneled in cheap acoustic tile, the kind they used to put in office buildings in the 70s, the kind made of compressed white fiber with a rough pebble texture. The tiles were held in place by a thin metal grid. She raised the flashlight beam straight up. For a moment, she did not see it. The tiles all looked the same, white pebbled, identical. Then she did see it. One tile in the back corner of the closet directly above the wooden shelf was very slightly offset from the others, maybe a 1/4 inch out of true. A sliver of black darkness showed through the gap. Look up. Addie pulled herself up onto the wooden shelf. The shelf groaned under her weight, but it held. She put one hand against the closet wall to steady herself. She raised the other hand against the ceiling tile, and she pushed. The tile lifted easily. She slid it sideways into the open, dark space beyond, and a small avalanche of dry rot and dust and pink insulation fibers fell down into her face. She coughed. She turned her head away. She closed her eyes for a moment and let the dust settle. Then she opened her eyes and shone the flashlight up through the hole. There was a metal drop-down ladder folded against the ceiling of the attic above her, a heavy commercial-grade aluminum ladder, the kind a contractor would install. There was a thin steel cable attached to a hook at the bottom of the ladder, and she reached up and caught the cable, and she pulled. The ladder unfolded with a series of sharp metallic clanks that sounded in the dead silent house like a string of gunshots. She froze. She listened. Nothing. No answering sound. Nothing but the wind outside. She climbed. The attic was much larger than she had expected. It ran the entire length of the A-frame, perhaps 30 feet from end to end, and the ceiling was vaulted and high, mirroring the steep pitch of the roof. A single small circular window was set into the front gable, the glass dark with grime. The floor was plywood swept clean, much cleaner than the rooms below. The smell up here was different, less mildew, more cedar, more dry paper. Addie pulled herself up through the hole and stood up cautiously. She swept the flashlight from side to side. The attic was nearly empty. There were a handful of unmarked cardboard boxes against the side wall. There was an old wooden rocking chair draped in a sheet in the far left corner. There was a coil of yellow extension cord hanging from a nail. There was nothing else, except in the far back corner of the attic against the rear wall of the house, her flashlight beam hit something massive and metallic, and the beam came back at her like a thrown punch. She walked toward it. Her footsteps thumped softly on the plywood. The thing in the corner grew larger in her vision as she got close, and larger still, until she was standing in front of it, and she had to tilt her head back to see the top. It was a safe, but it was not a safe like any safe she had ever seen. It was a vault, a 6-foot brushed steel rectangle bolted directly into the floor and into the heavy ceiling joists above it with bolts the size of her thumb. The door was the entire front face, hinged on the right side with 3 industrial hinges as thick as her wrist. It had a heavy steel wheel set in the center for the locking bolts, and beside the wheel was a digital keypad with a small green LED screen. The whole thing was the size of a refrigerator. It was the kind of vault a man would install in a bank vault room, the kind of vault a man would install when he was protecting something that mattered more than money. Her father had hauled this thing up here, or paid someone to. He had bolted it into the bones of a forgotten farmhouse in the middle of the Wisconsin woods. He had built her a hidden door, and behind that door he had built her this. Addie walked the last few steps to the vault on legs that did not feel like her own. She raised the flashlight beam to the keypad, and the world fell out from under her. The keypad had been destroyed, not pried at, not picked, destroyed. The digital screen was shattered, the plastic housing cracked open and pulled half away from the metal beneath. The keys had been knocked off. Wires hung out of the back of the housing like the entrails of a small animal. The steel faceplate around the keypad was scarred with deep blackened grooves, the kind of grooves a high-speed angle grinder would leave in tempered steel. The grooves ran in a rough oval around the keypad area, as if whoever had attacked the vault had been trying to cut all the way through the front plate and into the locking mechanism behind it. He had not succeeded. The steel was too thick, but he had tried. Addie dropped to her knees in front of the massive door. She put both hands against the cold steel. She was 19 years old, and she had driven 5 hours through a snowstorm into the middle of nowhere on the strength of a letter from her dead father, and the only thing that letter had pointed her toward had been destroyed 3 days ago by a man in tactical boots. The man had not gotten in, but she was not going to get in either. Whatever was inside the steel rectangle was going to stay inside it until somebody came up here with a thermal lance and cut the whole vault apart, which was something Addie was never going to be able to afford, and which Camilla and Bennett and Harrison Pemberton certainly would be. She put her forehead against the cold steel, and she let out a long, shuddering breath. She had nothing. She had less than nothing. She had a wrecked Honda Civic with a quarter tank of gas and $11 in a checking account she could no longer reach because she had no Wi-Fi out here, and a tackle box and a useless brass key and an even more useless silver key and a manila folder full of paper that proved nothing without whatever was inside this vault. She had spent the last of everything she had to drive up here. She was going to die in this house. She was going to die in this attic. She was going to die in the cold. She sat back on her heels. She closed her eyes, and after a long time she opened them again, because giving up was not a thing her father had raised her to do, and even if he was wrong about everything else, he was not wrong about that. Then she saw it. Taped to the side of the destroyed keypad, housing half hidden behind a flap of broken plastic, was a small yellow sticky note, the kind of 3x3 sticky note that came in a pad. It had not been disturbed by the man with the angle grinder. He had been concentrating on the steel, not on the trim around it. The sticky note was perfectly clean and perfectly intact, and there was small slanted handwriting on it, and the handwriting was her father's. Addie's hands went to it before her brain caught up. She peeled the sticky note off. It came away cleanly. She held it up to the flashlight beam with shaking fingers. There were 5 words on it. Birdie, if keypad broken, look behind panel. She read it 3 times. She read it 4 times. Her father had known. Her father had known they would find the vault. Her father had known they would attack the keypad, and her father had planned for it. He had built a second way in. He had built a backup. He had spent his clear-headed days in between bouts of drugged confusion, anticipating every move his murderers might make, and he had left her a sticky note. She set the flashlight down on the plywood, angled up so the beam lit her work. She pulled out the small folding pocket knife she had bought at the Walmart for $2. She opened the blade. She wedged the tip behind the cracked plastic housing of the keypad alongside the angle grinder grooves, and she pried. The plastic shell did not want to come. It had been glued in addition to being screwed. She pried harder. She worked the blade up and down. After 2 long minutes of careful prying, with sweat running down her temples, despite the cold, the housing came free in her hand. She set it aside. Underneath, set flush into the steel face of the vault, was a small, round, mechanical keyhole, the kind you would find in an old bank safe, round, brass polished, and completely undamaged by the attack on the digital keypad above it. The man with the angle grinder had been so focused on the obvious lock that he had never noticed the small round disc beside it. He had never thought to look behind. Addie pulled the silver safe deposit box key from her pocket. It was the only key she had left. The brass key had opened the front door. This silver key had opened the bank box. There were no other keys. If the silver key did not fit this round hole, she was done. She slid the key in. It fit. She turned it. For a half second, nothing happened, and Addie was sure she had done something wrong, and her hands began to shake again. And then deep inside the wall of the vault, a series of heavy mechanical bolts slid back with a sound like a freight train shunting cars in a rail yard at night. Clack, clack, clack. The wheel on the front of the vault turned a 1/4 inch on its own. Addie put both hands on the wheel. She put both feet flat against the plywood. She pulled. The door swung open. The hinges groaned with the slow, deep complaint of metal that had not been moved in years. The smell that came out of the vault was the smell of dry paper and gun oil and the inside of a leather wallet. Addie picked up the flashlight. She shone it into the dark interior. She had to grab the door frame to keep from sitting down. The vault was bigger inside than it had looked outside, maybe 4 feet deep. 3 steel shelves had been bolted into the interior walls, and on those shelves, in neat ordered rows, was the answer to every question Adelaide Whitlock had been afraid to ask for the last 6 months. On the bottom shelf were the bricks of cash, shrink-wrapped stacks of $100 bills, each stack the size of a brick, each stack worth $10,000 at a guess. She counted 8 of them, $80,000 in physical paper. Beside the cash, in 3 small velvet pouches, the color of dark wine, were dozens of 1-ounce gold coins, Krugerrands. She picked one up. It was heavier than she had expected. The gold was dull and warm and somehow alive in her palm. 3 pouches, perhaps 100 coins, perhaps 2. She did not yet know that the contents of those 3 pouches alone were worth more than $500,000. But it was not the gold that mattered. On the middle shelf, sitting perfectly centered, like an offering on an altar, was a thick black leather-bound journal. Beside the journal sat 2 small black external hard drives, the kind you could buy at any electronics store, with thin USB cables coiled neatly beside them, and beside the hard drives was a single heavy manila envelope sealed with red wax. On the front of the envelope, written in her father's slanted hand in thick black marker, was one word: checkmate. Addie sat down on the plywood in front of the open vault. She picked up the envelope. The wax seal cracked under her thumb. The envelope opened. She slid out a thick stack of documents. The top document was a last will and testament. It was 11 pages long. It was dated 5 days before her father's death. It was signed by Theodore James Whitlock in the same trembling hand as the letter in the tackle box. It was witnessed by two notarized signatures she did not recognize. It was stamped and sealed by a Wisconsin notary public out of a town called Wausau, 2 hours west. She read the first page, then the second, then the third. It was simple. It was very simple. Her father had revoked all previous wills. He had specifically named the will dated 3 weeks before his death. The will Harrison Pemberton had read in the study, the will that had given Camilla everything, and he had revoked that one line by line with cited reasons of duress, of forgery, of fraud. And then he had given everything to her. The company, Whitlock Logistics, valued in the most recent fiscal year at $1.8 billion. The estate at Lake Forest, the 2 condos in Chicago she had not even known he owned, the vacation property in Door County, the portfolio of stocks, the offshore accounts, the bank accounts, the trust funds, all of it, to Adelaide Margaret Whitlock, his daughter, his only living child. The will explicitly disinherited Camilla Ashford Whitlock and Bennett Ashford. It cited in plain language the grounds: material breach of marital trust, conspiracy to defraud, conspiracy to deny medical care, and in a single line near the bottom of page 9, conspiracy resulting in attempted physical harm to the testator. Attempted physical harm. Her father had known he was being hurt. Addie set the will down. She picked up the next document in the stack. It was a 4-page report on the letterhead of a private laboratory in Geneva, Switzerland. The lab was called Helvetica Analytic. The report was a toxicology screen. The sample had been taken from her father's blood and from a vial of what was labeled as his prescribed cardiac medication, and the samples had been shipped overnight to Switzerland via a private courier whose name Addie did not recognize. The report had been issued 7 weeks before her father's death. She read the report slowly. She did not understand all of it, but she understood enough. Her father's cardiac medication was supposed to be a beta blocker called metoprolol, 300 milligrams a day taken in 3 doses, standard for a man with his history. The vial in his medicine cabinet, the vial that had been refilled by the household nurse every 14 days for the previous 8 months, the vial he had taken pills out of every morning, was not metoprolol. The white pills inside that vial had been manufactured to look like metoprolol. They had been pressed in the same shape and the same size and the same scoring as metoprolol. They had been packaged with the same blue-printed label, but they were not metoprolol. They were a synthetic compound the lab identified as a long-chain methamphetamine analog, an untraceable amphetamine, the kind of compound a research chemist might make in a private lab, the kind of compound that would not show up in any standard hospital drug screen, the kind of compound that taken every day for 8 months by a 56-year-old man with a damaged heart would push that heart harder and harder and harder until one morning, without warning, it simply tore itself in half. Addie read the report twice. Then she read it a 3rd time, just to be sure she had not lost her mind. She had not. She picked up the next document. It was a printout of an email exchange. The email at the top was dated 9 months before her father's death. The sender was Camilla Ashford Whitlock. The recipient was Harrison Pemberton. The subject line was a single word: progress. Addie read the email. She read the next email. She read the next. There were 31 pages of emails. They went on for 8 months. They detailed in cold, practical sentences the entire conspiracy. The arrangement with the household nurse, a woman named Beverly, something who had been paid $320,000 over 4 years to replace her father's heart medication with the methamphetamine analog every 14 days and to walk out the door with the real pills and dispose of them in a public dumpster on her drive home. The arrangement with a chemist in Pennsylvania who had manufactured the analog. The arrangement with Harrison Pemberton to begin drafting a revised will the moment her father's mental clarity began to decline noticeably. The arrangement with a New York wealth manager who would be installed as the new trustee of the company within 30 days of her father's death. The line items of expected payouts to Bennett. The plans for Adelaide, who was in one email Addie read with her hands shaking so hard the paper rattled, referred to as the loose end, and would be removed from the estate within 6 months of probate clearing. Removed from the estate. Her father had not died of a heart attack. Her father had been murdered, slowly, methodically, patiently, over 8 months, by his wife and by his lawyer and by a household nurse named Beverly, something who had been paid $320,000 to put poison in a pill bottle. Adelaide Whitlock sat on the plywood floor of an attic in the Wisconsin woods, surrounded by gold coins and bricks of cash and the proof of her father's murder, and she did not move, and she did not breathe, and she did not make any sound at all. The flashlight beam shone steadily on the open vault. The wind moved against the small, grimy window in the front gable. Somewhere a tree branch tapped against the side of the house. She did not cry. The grief that came up in her in that moment was too large for crying. It was a slow, black tide. It moved up from her stomach into her chest and into her throat, and it sat there heavy and full and silent, and after some long time, it began to change into something else, something colder, something that did not have a name. She picked up the black leather-bound journal. She opened the cover. The first page had a date at the top. The date was 9 months before her father's death. The handwriting was strong, neat, his old handwriting, the handwriting of a businessman who had filled out shipping manifests in his 20s and never quite lost the habit of writing fast and clean. Today I noticed that my morning pill is the wrong color. The metoprolol from the pharmacy is white with a thin blue line. The pill Beverly gave me this morning was white with a slightly thicker blue line. The difference is subtle. I might be imagining it. I am going to start saving 1 pill out of each bottle in an envelope under the floorboard of the gun safe. If I am imagining it, I will throw the envelope away in a few months. If I am not, someone else will need to see them. Addie turned the page. The entries went on for nearly 9 months. They were brief and methodical at first. The handwriting was steady. Her father had been a man who kept a logbook of every fish he ever caught, every truck he ever drove, every shipment his company ever moved. He kept a logbook of his own murder the same way. He had figured it out by month 3. By month 4, he was secretly skipping pills on alternate days, hiding them in an envelope under a floorboard, and he was recording how much clearer his head felt on the days he skipped. By month 5, he had hired a private investigator out of Milwaukee to follow Camilla. By month 6, the investigator had given him the first photographs of Camilla meeting Harrison Pemberton at a Marriott in Schaumburg. By month 7, he had begun shipping the pills in secret to Switzerland for analysis. By month 8, he had the lab report. The handwriting began to falter around month 8. The letters got shakier. The dates got further apart. Her father wrote on a page dated 11 days before his death the following sentence: I do not have time to expose them through the courts. They control my lawyer. They will say I am a sick old man. I have to leave Adelaide a path. I have to leave her a way to find this herself on her own terms when they have shown her who they really are. I do not want her to know any of this from me. I want her to find it. I want her to be the one who brings them down. She is more like me than she knows. She will do it. She will do it. Addie put her hand over her mouth. She had to read the next page through tears that she did not remember starting to cry. The page was the last page her father had written. The handwriting was so weak it barely held the line of the paper. Birdie, if you have made it here, do not call the police in Lake Forest. Pemberton has them. Do not call any lawyer in Illinois. Pemberton knows them all. Drive to Chicago and walk into the FBI field office at 2111 West Roosevelt Road. Ask for the White Collar Division. Take the hard drives. Take this journal. Take the Swiss report. Take the will. Take the gold for travel money. Leave the cash. The cash can be tracked. There is a witness. Beverly, the nurse, is gone, but there was another nurse, a woman named Mabel Greaves. She worked the morning shift before Beverly was hired. She quit suddenly 9 months ago. The investigator believes she was offered a bribe and refused. She is in hiding. The investigator's last known address for her is in Indianapolis. The address is in the second hard drive, the one labeled with a green sticker. Find her. She will talk to you. She is afraid, but she is a good woman. She loved your mother. She has been waiting for someone to come. I am so sorry, Birdie. I am so sorry I could not stop them in time. I am so sorry I will not see what you become. I am so proud of you. I am so proud. Look in the back of the vault. There is one more thing, for when you have time. Look in the back. Dad. Adelaide Whitlock set the journal down on the plywood floor. She did not move for a long time. After what might have been 10 minutes or might have been an hour, she crawled forward on her knees and she shone the flashlight into the back of the vault behind the shelves, into the deeper dark she had not yet examined. There, taped to the back inner wall of the vault with a single strip of silver duct tape, was a small black object the size of a deck of cards, a digital video recording device, a tiny camcorder, the kind a journalist might carry. The screen was folded flat against the body. A red label had been stuck to the front. The label said in her father's hand 3 words, "For Adelaide, last." She did not pick it up, not yet. She could not. She did not have the strength tonight. She would come back for it. She would watch it when she was somewhere safe. She knew in some quiet animal part of her that whatever was on that camera was going to be her father's voice, his actual voice, speaking to her from a moment in time before he had died. And she absolutely could not take that on top of everything else tonight. She closed the vault carefully. She did not lock it. She did not have the heart to. She gathered what she could carry, the 2 hard drives, the journal, the checkmate envelope with the real will and the toxicology report, and the printed emails, 1 velvet pouch of gold coins, the smallest one. She left the cash. She left the other 2 pouches of gold. She would come back for them, if she lived. She climbed back down the metal ladder. She slid the displaced ceiling tile back into place. She walked through the empty master bedroom and down the creaking stairs and through the trash study and across the dust-covered living room, retracing the boot prints of the man who had failed 3 days earlier to do what her father had spent the last year of his life preventing. At the front door, she stopped. She set her hand against the door frame. She turned and looked back into the dark, cold body of the house her father had built for her, the house no one had known existed, the house that had held the answers. She whispered into the silence the only thing she could think of to say. "I will finish it," she said. "I will finish it for you." She stepped out onto the porch. The snow had stopped. The sky had cleared. The clearing was lit in a faint blue light from a half moon that had risen behind the pines. The air was very cold and very still. Addie stood on the porch with the manila folder and the journal pressed against her chest and the small velvet pouch of gold coins in the pocket of her jeans, and she breathed in the cold pine air, and for the first time since the brass deadbolt in Lake Forest had clicked behind her 17 days ago, she felt something close to alive. Then she heard it, far away, down the unmarked logging road, the faint, unmistakable sound of tires moving slowly over loose gravel, the sound of a heavy vehicle coming up the road, toward the house, toward her. Adelaide Whitlock stood frozen on the porch, the manila folder clutched against her chest, and she listened to the sound of the Suburban climbing the logging road in the silver Wisconsin moonlight, and she understood with a clarity colder than the air around her that the second half of her life, the half that began the moment her father had died, was about to begin in earnest tonight. For 3 full seconds, Adelaide Whitlock did not move. She stood on the porch of the dark farmhouse, and she listened to the sound of the heavy tires climbing the logging road, and her brain worked very fast and very cold, the way she had heard her father's brain worked when something had gone wrong on a shipping dock in the middle of the night. The sound was still far, maybe a quarter mile, maybe less. The Suburban was moving carefully on the rough road, and that meant she had 2 minutes, maybe 3. She did not run for the Honda Civic. The Civic was parked in the open clearing. They would see it the moment they came around the last bend. If she tried to start it and back out, they would block the road. Their vehicle was faster, heavier, higher off the ground. She would die in that car. She would die 2 miles down the logging road with the manila folder still in her hand. She turned and went back inside the house. She closed the front door behind her with both hands slowly so the hinges would not shriek. She crossed the living room in the dark on the balls of her feet. She knew the house now. She did not need the flashlight. She climbed the stairs, skipping the 3rd step because she remembered it had cracked under her weight on the way up, and she crossed the master bedroom and stepped into the walk-in closet and pulled herself up onto the wooden shelf again. She slid the ceiling tile open. She caught the bottom of the ladder before it had a chance to clank. She lowered it gently, hand over hand, and climbed up into the attic and pulled the ladder up behind her and slid the tile back into place. Below her faintly, she heard the sound of tires on the frozen grass of the clearing, then the sound of 2 doors opening, then the sound of 2 doors closing. Addie crawled across the plywood floor of the attic to the small, grimy, round window in the front gable. She pressed her face against the cold glass, and she looked down. The Suburban had parked directly behind her Honda Civic, blocking it in. The headlights were on 2 long cones of yellow that lit the front of the farmhouse in stark, bright relief and threw enormous shadows of the porch railings against the siding. 2 men stood in the cones of light, the big man with the buzz cut and the heavy jaw, the man she had seen on the highway. He had a black coat now and what looked like a long flashlight in one hand and what was unmistakably a pistol with a long suppressor screwed onto the barrel in the other. And beside him, stepping carefully through the snow in a tailored charcoal trench coat and polished black shoes, holding a black umbrella against snow that had stopped 20 minutes ago, was a man she had known for 15 years of her life. Harrison Pemberton, Uncle Harry, the silver-haired lawyer who had carried her on his shoulders at a 4th of July picnic when she was 6 years old. She watched him from the attic window. She watched him gesture toward the front porch with one gloved hand. She watched him speak in a low voice to the man beside him. The wind was wrong. She could not hear what he said, but she could see his face in the bounce of the headlights, and his face was nothing she had ever seen before. There was no warmth in it. There was no hesitation. There was no Uncle Harry. There was only a calculating, focused, almost surgical attention to a problem that needed to be solved. The problem was her. The big man nodded once. He started toward the porch. Harrison Pemberton stayed by the Suburban with his umbrella the way a foreman stays by the truck while the work is done. The big man climbed the porch steps with the suppressed pistol held low against his thigh. The window was too small for Addie to climb through. The wooden louvers on the outside of the window were old and rotted and might break easily, but the actual frame inside the louvers was a circle of cast iron set into the gable wall, and the diameter of the circle was maybe 16 inches. She could not fit through 16 inches. There was another window, she remembered now, a second small circular window in the rear gable on the back side of the house. She had seen it from the attic earlier when she had swept her flashlight around the room. She crawled back across the plywood. The rear window was identical to the front. Same cast iron frame, same rotted wooden louvers on the outside, same 16 inches. She was not going to fit. She was not going to get out either window. Below her on the first floor, she heard the front door open. She heard the heavy footfall of tactical boots on hard wood, the same boots that had made the prints in the dust 3 days ago, slow, methodical. The big man knew she was inside the house. He had seen her car. He was not in a hurry. Addie sat on the plywood floor of the attic with her back against the rear gable wall, and she made herself breathe slowly, and she thought about what her father would have done. Her father would have used the house. Her father had built the house. He had paid for the vault. He had run the electric. He had bolted the steel into the joists. He had planned for the day a man like the man downstairs would come into this attic. He had left her a sticky note in case the keypad was destroyed. He would have left her a way out too. There would be a way out. She just had to find it. She got to her knees. She picked up her flashlight and she held her hand over the lens so only a thin sliver of light escaped between her fingers. She crawled along the side wall of the attic, slowly looking at the floor, looking at the wall, looking at the ceiling beams. She found it at the very back of the attic, 6 feet to the right of the rear gable window. A small section of the sidewall between 2 studs had been finished with a piece of paneling slightly different from the rest. The grain ran horizontally instead of vertically. The nail heads were countersunk and puttied over. The whole panel was maybe 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, and it sat low against the floor, and along the bottom edge of it, almost invisible in the gray dust, was a thin rectangular line, a hatch. Addie set the flashlight down. She set her fingers in the line, and she pulled. The panel moved a 1/4 inch. She pulled harder. It came free in her hands. Behind it was a black square opening into nothing, and a cold draft hit her face, and she shone the flashlight into the dark. It was a duct, a square sheet metal duct, maybe 2 feet wide and 2 feet tall, lined on the inside with insulation running down at a slight angle from the attic toward the back wall of the house. It looked like the kind of duct that might be used for an old industrial dust collection system, the kind a man building an outbuilding for a workshop might install. It did not connect to anything in the house that she had seen. It just went down, and it ended somewhere below her in a thin square of darker dark. She did not know where it ended. She did not have time to know. Below her, in the master bedroom, she heard the floorboards creak. The big man had reached the second floor. Addie pulled the manila folder, the journal, the 2 hard drives, and the small velvet pouch of gold coins out from where she had stacked them by the vault. She shoved them all into the front of her hoodie against her stomach, and she pulled the drawstring of the hood tight around her waist so nothing could fall out. She lay flat on her belly. She pushed her feet into the duct first, then she let herself slide. The metal was cold against her back and her arms even through the hoodie. The duct dropped at maybe a 30-degree angle, steep enough that she could not stop her own slide once she had started. She tried to slow herself by pressing her elbows against the sides. The insulation crackled and tore. Her feet hit something solid at the bottom and bounced off, and then she was sliding faster, the angle steepening, and she put her arms over her head to protect her face, and she dropped through the dark. She came out of the bottom of the duct hard. She hit a pile of frozen leaves in a small lean-to addition behind the house. The lean-to had been built around the bottom of the duct, hiding it from view. The floor was raked up oak leaves and rotted firewood and pine needles. Her shoulder hit the wood floor and pain bloomed white across her vision. She bit down on her own lip to keep from crying out. She tasted blood. She rolled onto her side and lay there for a long second, breathing. Above her, far above, she heard a single word shouted in the attic of the house. She could not make it out. A man's voice, surprised, then angry, then a second voice, fainter, calling something from the front of the house. Harrison. Addie got to her knees. She got to her feet. The lean-to had a single rough wooden door cut into its back wall, latched with a piece of bent nail. She lifted the latch. She pushed the door open. The hinges groaned. She stepped out of the lean-to and into the snow. She was at the back of the property. Behind her, 50 feet across, an open patch of frozen brown grass, the pine woods began, thick, black, unbroken. She did not look back at the house. She did not let herself. She ran for the trees. She made it to the tree line in 15 seconds. She did not stop at the edge. She kept running deeper into the pines, where the snow under her sneakers gave way to a thick brown carpet of frozen needles, and where the canopy overhead was so dense that the moonlight came down in thin scattered patches, and the trunks of the trees became dark vertical walls she had to navigate by feel as much as by sight. Behind her, somewhere back at the house, she heard a man begin to shout, then a second voice, then a sound she would remember for the rest of her life, the clean, dry crack of a suppressed pistol firing into the night. Once, twice, 3 times, the bullets cut into the trees somewhere behind her. She felt one of them, or thought she felt one of them, slap against the bark of a pine 10 feet to her right. She ran for an hour. She did not look at her watch. She did not have a watch. She ran by instinct. She ran on the strength of every drop of adrenaline her 19-year-old body could produce, and when the adrenaline began to run out, she ran on the memory of her father's voice in the boat at 4 a.m. when she was 8 years old. The most important things are almost never the ones that look important. She ran on Miss Nellie's voice across a picnic table on a cold morning at the Niles Walmart. Your daddy didn't raise you to die in a car, sweetheart. She ran on the memory of Bennett Ashford's grin behind the leaded glass of the front door, and the thought of that grin was a small hot coal in the center of her chest that she could not let go cold. Somewhere in the second hour, she stopped running. She had to. Her legs would no longer carry her. She put her hand against the trunk of a pine, and she leaned forward and she vomited a thin string of bile onto the frozen needles. She had not eaten in 18 hours. Her hands and her face were cut from low branches. Her left ankle was swollen and throbbing from where she had landed wrong out of the duct. The manila folder against her stomach was wet with cold sweat and was beginning to come apart at the corners. She did not know which direction she was going. The moon was hidden now behind a layer of cloud, and the pines all looked the same. She kept walking. She walked for another 2 hours. She did not stop. She did not let herself sit down, because she knew if she sat down, she would not get up. She kept her father's voice running in her head. The most important things are almost never the ones that look important. The most important things. The most important things. Somewhere around 4 in the morning, by what she could tell from the position of a thin gray smear in the eastern sky, the trees began to thin. The brown carpet of needles gave way to brittle brown grass. The grass gave way to a fence line of rusted barbed wire half pulled out of the dirt. Beyond the fence was a flat field. Beyond the field was a county road, a paved 2-lane county road with a single white stripe down the middle and a yellow reflective sign on the far shoulder marking a sharp curve ahead. Addie climbed through the barbed wire. She left a strip of her hoodie on a barb. She walked across the field and stepped up onto the shoulder of the road, and she stood there in the dark, swaying slightly on her bad ankle, and she waited. She did not know how long she waited. Long enough that her teeth had stopped chattering because her body had given up on shivering. Long enough that the gray smear in the east had turned to a thin pink line. Long enough that she had started to wonder if perhaps no one drove this road ever, and she was going to have to lie down in the ditch and try to keep warm until full daylight, and maybe by then some farmer would come by on a tractor. 3 vehicles passed her over the next 20 minutes. The first was a pickup truck that slowed down to look at her, the driver's face leaning over the wheel, and then sped up again and drove on. The second was a green Wisconsin DNR truck that did not slow down at all. The third, just before 5 in the morning, by the position of the slowly graying sky, was a semi-truck, a long-haul Peterbilt, the cab painted a faded dark red, pulling a 53-foot dry van with the name of a regional grocery distributor on the side. The Peterbilt slowed. The air brakes hissed. The truck pulled off onto the shoulder ahead of her, the brake lights washing the road in red, and the passenger side door swung open with the heavy thunk of an old, well-built piece of American iron. The driver leaned across the cab to look down at her. He was a man maybe 60 years old. His face was deeply lined, and his hair was the gray of winter wheat. He wore a black wool work coat over a red plaid flannel shirt. He looked at her bruised face and her cut hands and the manila folder she was clutching against her stomach, and he did not say a single word. He just jerked his thumb toward the empty passenger seat. Addie climbed up into the cab. The truck rolled back onto the road. For 10 minutes, the man did not speak. He drove. He kept the engine quiet and the cab warm. The dashboard radio was off. The only sound was the steady drone of the diesel and the slap of the wipers across the windshield, where a fine cold mist had begun to come down out of the pre-dawn sky. Then he reached behind his seat with one hand without taking his eyes off the road, and he pulled out a steel thermos and a stack of small paper cups. He poured 1 cup of coffee. He set it on the dashboard in front of her. "Drink slow," he said. His voice was low and steady. It was the first thing he had said to her. "It is hot." Addie picked up the cup. Her hands were shaking so hard, The coffee slopped over the side. She drank. The coffee burned her tongue. She did not care. She drank it down to the dregs. The man poured another cup without asking. He pulled a foil-wrapped sandwich out of a small, soft-sided cooler beside his seat, and he set it on the dashboard beside the second cup, egg and cheese on a hard roll by the smell of it. He did not say anything. He kept driving. After the second cup, when her hands had begun to come back under her control, and after she had eaten half the sandwich without being able to remember picking it up, he spoke again. "Where are you headed?" the man said. "Chicago," she said. He nodded once slowly. "I am headed Indianapolis. After Chicago," he said. "I will drop you anywhere downtown. Roosevelt Road, if that suits." Addie turned to look at him. Roosevelt Road was the address of the FBI field office, the address her father had written in the last entry of his journal. The man could not possibly have known that. The man did not know her name. The man did not know anything. "It just suits," she said. He nodded again, and he did not ask her another question for the next 4.5 hours. His name was Wendell Pike. She got that from the laminated DOT card hanging from the visor. She did not learn anything else about him until much later. She did not need to. He drove the truck through the gray dawn and into the gray morning south, through Wisconsin and across the Illinois border and into the suburbs of Chicago, and he asked her no questions about her face or her hands or the folder against her stomach, and when she fell asleep with her head against the cold passenger window somewhere outside Rockford, he turned the heater up 2 notches and lowered the radio that he had finally turned on, and he drove the last 3 hours in a silence so deliberate that she slept the whole way without dreaming. He woke her gently with one hand on her shoulder when they reached the on-ramp for I-290 into the city. He took the Roosevelt Road exit. He pulled the Peterbilt into the loading zone of a Walgreens 2 blocks from the FBI building because the truck would not fit on the street in front of it. He turned to her. "This is as close as I can get you," he said. Addie reached for the door handle. She stopped. She turned back. She looked at the old man with the gray hair and the deeply lined face. She tried to think of something to say. She could not think of anything. He saw her struggling. He shook his head once. "Your daddy was a good man," Wendell Pike said quietly. "I do not know what your daddy did for a living. I do not know your name, but I have driven a truck on the open road for 31 years, and I can tell a young woman whose father raised her right from a young woman whose father did not, and your daddy raised you right. Go do what you came to do." Addie nodded. She could not speak. She climbed down from the cab. She closed the door behind her with both hands. The Peterbilt rolled forward. It turned the corner at the next light. It was gone. She stood on the sidewalk of Roosevelt Road in the gray Chicago morning with the manila folder against her stomach and the 2 hard drives in her hoodie pocket, and she began to walk. The lobby of the FBI field office at 2111 West Roosevelt Road had a metal detector and 3 armed federal officers in dark blue uniforms and a polished gray floor that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner. The officer at the desk looked up at her as she came through the door. She was bruised dirty in a torn gray hoodie with bits of pine needles still in her hair, and her left ankle was visibly swollen above her sneaker. "I need to speak to an agent," she said. "The white-collar crime division. I have evidence of a murder." The officer looked at her for a long moment. He picked up the phone. The agent who came down to the lobby 25 minutes later was a woman in her early 50s. She wore a charcoal pantsuit and low black heels and a small gold cross on a chain at her throat. Her hair was the color of black coffee, cut short and practical. Her eyes were a steady, deep brown that took Addie in without judgment and without surprise. She did not smile, but her face was not unkind. She introduced herself as Special Agent Beatrice Holloway. She said most people called her B. She said Addie could call her that too. Agent Holloway took her up to the fourth floor in a quiet elevator. She put Addie in a small conference room with a long table and a pitcher of water and a box of tissues. She brought her a sandwich from the cafeteria, ham and cheese on white bread, and a bottle of orange juice. Then she left for 10 minutes and came back with a young bureau medic who looked at Addie's ankle, wrapped it tightly with a brown elastic bandage, gave her 2 over-the-counter painkillers in a small paper cup, and left without saying a word about whatever else he could see in her face. Then Agent Holloway sat down across from her, and she folded her hands on the table. "Tell me," Agent Holloway said. Addie told her. She told her everything. She told her about Camilla and Bennett. She told her about Harrison Pemberton and the false will. She told her about the green tackle box and Miss Nellie at the Niles Walmart and the safe deposit key. She told her about Black River Falls and the dust on the floor and the boot prints leading to the empty study. She told her about the safe in the attic and the destroyed keypad and the small yellow sticky note. She told her about the gold and the cash and the checkmate envelope. She told her about the Swiss toxicology report. She told her about the man with the buzz cut and the suppressed pistol firing into the trees behind her in the dark. She set the manila folder on the table. She set the 2 hard drives on the table. She set the journal on the table. She set the small velvet pouch of gold coins on the table. Agent Beatrice Holloway looked at the items on the table for a long, quiet moment. She looked up at Addie. The professional neutrality in her face was gone. Something else was in its place, something harder, something almost personal. "I have been a federal agent for 23 years, Agent Holloway said. "I have heard a lot of stories in this room. I want you to know I believe every word of yours. Sit tight, Adelaide. Drink your orange juice. I am going to make some phone calls." She left the room. Addie ate the sandwich in 5 bites. She drank the orange juice. She put her head down on the table and she closed her eyes for what she thought was 30 seconds. When she opened them again, 2 hours had passed and Agent Holloway had come back into the room with 3 other agents and a forensic computer specialist named Ortiz, who had begun the slow work of unlocking the 2 encrypted hard drives. Agent Holloway also brought a bureau-issued sweatshirt and a clean pair of socks and a paper bag with a toothbrush and a small tube of toothpaste and a comb. She showed Addie to a small room with a single bed and a shower at the end of the hall. She told her to sleep. She told her there were 2 armed agents outside the door. She told her no one was going to get to her tonight. Addie slept for 14 hours. When she woke up, it was the next afternoon. The bureau medic had come in once while she slept and changed the bandage on her ankle. Agent Holloway was waiting in a small kitchenette down the hall with a cup of coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. Addie ate it all slowly, sitting at a formica table that reminded her of the cafeteria at her middle school. Agent Holloway sat across from her and drank her own coffee and did not say much. The first hard drive came up clean by mid-afternoon. The second drive took until the next morning. When the second drive opened at 9:06 on a Thursday morning, Agent Holloway brought Addie into a windowless room with 3 computer screens, and she sat her down in front of them, and she said before they began that she was sorry for what Addie was about to see. The second hard drive had a folder titled in her father's handwriting on the digital label Bennett. Inside the folder were 370 emails. The emails went back 4 years. 4 years. The earliest email was dated when Bennett Ashford was 18 years old and a freshman at Yale. The most recent email was dated 4 days before Theodore Whitlock's death. The emails were between Bennett and his mother Camilla, and they did not read the way Addie had expected the emails of a son who was being used as a piece by a manipulative mother to read. They read the other way around. Bennett had run the operation from the very beginning, from the first months of Camilla's marriage to Theodore Whitlock. When Bennett was a college freshman, home for Thanksgiving, and sitting in the family study and observing his new stepfather's prescription bottles on the mantelpiece. Bennett had identified the cardiac medication. Bennett had researched in his sophomore year of an Ivy League school the pharmacological action of beta blockers and the chemistry of methamphetamine analogs. Bennett had located the chemist in Pennsylvania. Bennett had identified Beverly, the household nurse, as a target for bribery and had instructed his mother in how to approach her. Bennett had recruited Harrison Pemberton in his junior year on a flight back to New Haven by promising Pemberton a permanent retainer of $2 million a year for life after the inheritance closed. His mother was a piece on his board. His mother was his cover. Bennett Ashford, 22 years old, fresh from an Ivy League graduation in May, with a charming grin and a hand-stitched suit and a future at Goldman Sachs already lined up for the next fall, had planned and executed the systematic 4-year murder of his stepfather, Adelaide Whitlock's father, the man who had paid for every credit hour of his college education with the precision of a chess master and the patience of a surgeon. He had done it for the money. He had done it for the company. He had done it because in one email Addie read, with her hands shaking so hard the paper rattled, he had decided very early on that Theodore Whitlock was a sentimental old fool who would never have the spine to do what needed to be done with Whitlock logistics. And Bennett had wanted to do what needed to be done. Adelaide Whitlock sat in front of the computer screen, and she felt the floor of her life tilt one more time, the last time, the deepest time, and she understood finally the full shape of the thing that had come for her family. The boy with the grin behind the leaded glass had not been a passenger. He had been the driver. He had always been the driver. Camilla, the cold marble woman she had spent 5 years hating, had only ever been the steering wheel. Agent Holloway put a hand on her shoulder. "We have enough now," Holloway said quietly. "We have everything we need. Adelaide, we have everything. There was one more thing." 3 days later, after Addie had given a sworn deposition and signed the protective custody paperwork and slept for 14 more hours in a bureau safe house bed in a quiet apartment building in Oak Park, Agent Holloway came to her with a small evidence bag in her hand. Inside the bag was the small black camcorder Addie had not been able to bring herself to take out of the back of the vault. The Bureau had returned to Black River Falls and had recovered it along with the cash and the remaining gold and a dozen other small items Theodore Whitlock had left behind in the back of his vault that Addie had not yet had the heart to look for. "There is a video file on the device," Agent Holloway said. "I have not watched it. The forensics team has confirmed it has not been tampered with. He recorded it 11 days before his death. It is addressed to you." She handed Addie the camera. She left the room. Addie sat alone in the safe house bedroom, and she folded out the small screen of the camera, and she pressed play. Her father appeared on the small screen. He had aged 20 years since she had last seen him alive. His cheeks were hollow. His eyes were sunk deep into his skull. The strong, square shoulders, she remembered, were thin under a plaid flannel shirt she remembered from her childhood. He was sitting in the attic of the Black River Falls farmhouse on the plywood floor in front of the open vault with the small camera propped on a stack of cardboard boxes at his eye level. "Bertie," her father said. His voice was thin, but it was his. "If you are watching this, you have made it to the vault. I am so proud of you. I always knew you would. I knew the moment you found the tackle box that you would put the rest of it together. You are smarter than you know. You are smarter than I ever was at your age. You were always going to be the one to finish this." He paused. He took a slow, careful breath. Pain crossed his face. It passed. "I am going to be dead very soon," he said. "I do not know exactly when. The doctors say my heart is bad. The doctors do not know what I have been swallowing for 8 months. I am not going to tell them. If I tell them, the people who did this will know I know, and they will move faster, and I will not have time to leave you what you need. So I am taking the pills. I am letting it happen. I am sorry, Bertie. I do not see another way." Addie put her hand over her mouth. She did not lower it. "I want you to know 2 things," her father said. "The first thing is this. You think Camilla is the architect of what is happening to me. She is not. The architect is Bennett. The architect has been Bennett for 4 years. Camilla is afraid of him. She does what he tells her. I learned this from the investigator 3 weeks ago, and it broke something in me because I have been letting that boy live in our house, and I have been paying for his education, and I have been treating him like a son, and the entire time he has been waiting for me to die so he could take everything. The cruelty of it is the hardest part for me, not the dying, the cruelty." He stopped. He looked away from the camera for a moment. When he looked back, his eyes were shining. "The second thing," he said, "there is something on that second hard drive you are going to find. A folder I have labeled with the name Harrington Coal Global. Harrington Coal is a logistics company out of Atlanta. They are my biggest competitor. 3 months ago, my investigator confirmed that Bennett has been in private contact with the chairman of Harrington Coal since his sophomore year of college. They have been planning the takeover of Whitlock Logistics together. The arrangement is that Bennett will inherit the company through his mother, will then run it into the ground over 24 months and will then sell the distressed assets to Harrington Coal at a fraction of their value. In exchange, Bennett receives a personal payment of $40 million and a seat on the Harrington Coal board. The hitman who is going to come for you in Wisconsin, if it comes to that, is named Dorian Creel. He is on the Harrington Coal payroll. They have used him before. He has cleaned up at least 2 other corporate problems for them in Atlanta and in Mexico City. The Bureau will know who he is. Tell the Bureau his name," Adelaide, her father said. The video was nearly finished. She could see it in the timer at the corner of the screen. 20 seconds. 15. "I am sorry. I will not see what you become," he said. "But I know what you will become. You will be better than I was. You will be smarter, and you will be kinder, and you will be braver. You will take the company. You will run it the way I should have run it. You will use the money to do good things. You will find Mabel Greaves in Indianapolis, and you will give her a life back. You will find that old woman at the Walmart, the one with the gray braid, the one I have been watching from a distance for 2 years now, and you will give her a life back too. You will give a lot of people their lives back, Bertie. That is what you were born to do." "I love you," he said. "I love you, I love you, I love you." The screen went black. Addie sat alone in the safe house bedroom for a long time. She did not cry. The grief was past the place where crying came from. It sat in her chest like a stone she had been carrying for so long it had become part of her. She set the camera down on the nightstand beside the bed. She looked at the small, dark screen for a long minute. She thought about the man on that screen, about what it must have cost him in those last 11 days to sit alone in that attic with the pills already eating his heart, and to set up a camera and to talk to a daughter he would never see again. He had done it. He had done it without flinching. He had done it without asking for help because he had known there was no one to help him. And he had done it without bitterness, because bitterness was not a thing that Theo Whitlock allowed in himself ever, even when the world had set itself against him in the cruelest possible way. That was who her father had been. Then she got up and she washed her face in the small white bathroom at the end of the safe house bedroom, and she walked back down the hall to the bureau office where Agent Holloway sat, and she gave the agent the name of the company. She gave her the name of the chairman. She gave her the name Dorian Creel. 48 hours later, the federal task force was assembled. It was not a small operation. Agent Holloway brought in 3 of the Bureau's senior agents from the New York field office, 2 from Atlanta, and a forensic accountant from Washington named Lila Rotham, who had spent 14 years dismantling pharmaceutical fraud rings, and who, when shown the Harrington Cole emails, said only that she had been waiting for someone like Bennett Ashford to land on her desk for half her career, and now that he had, he was not going to enjoy what came next. Addie was offered protective relocation. She refused. Agent Holloway did not argue. She moved Addie instead to a different safe house, this one a small townhouse in a quiet part of Evanston, and she assigned 2 agents to her around the clock, and she sat with her every evening for a long, quiet hour with a cup of decaf coffee and updates from the field. The takedown happens on a Tuesday morning in early November. The weather had turned. The first hard freeze of the year had come overnight. The grass on the lawns of Lake Forest was crystallized with frost. The sun was just up. At 7:04 in the morning, 16 heavily armed FBI agents in tactical gear approached the limestone porch of the Whitlock estate. They did not knock. The lead agent kicked the brass dead-bolted front door off its hinges with a single boot. 6 agents poured into the foyer with weapons drawn. Camilla Ashford Whitlock was in the kitchen in a silk dressing gown, pouring coffee from a French press. She dropped the press. The glass shattered on the marble floor. She did not run. She did not protest. She stood very still with her hands at her sides while a female agent read her rights and snapped a pair of handcuffs around her thin wrists. The diamond on her left hand caught the morning light through the kitchen window. She did not look at anyone. She did not say a word. At 7:06 in the morning, in a private banking conference room on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, 3 FBI agents walked through the doors of a quarterly board meeting and asked Mr. Harrison Pemberton to please stand up. Pemberton stood. His face went the color of old paper. He set his pen down on the conference table very carefully. He said one word. He said, "How?" Then the agents read him his rights, and they walked him out of the building, and he did not look at the other men around the table as he went. At 7:09 in the morning, at a small private aviation terminal in suburban Waukegan, Illinois, 4 FBI agents in full tactical gear intercepted a young man in a tailored Navy overcoat at the door of a Gulfstream G450. The young man had a duffel bag over his shoulder. The duffel bag contained $220,000 in cash and 3 burner phones and a Canadian passport in the name of a man who did not exist. The plane's flight plan had been filed for Georgetown, Grand Cayman, with refueling in Charleston, South Carolina. The young man did not run. He did not fight. When the lead agent identified himself, the young man simply set down the duffel bag and put his hands behind his head. He looked in that moment like exactly what he was, a 22-year-old boy who had been very clever for a very long time and had run out of cleverness all at once. The grin was nowhere on his face. Dorian Creel was arrested 48 hours later in a motel in Joliet, Illinois, by an FBI tactical team. He resisted. He was wounded. He survived. He would, over the next 16 months, become the federal prosecutor's most valuable witness. He would name names. He would tie the entire conspiracy to Harrington Coal Global. He would put 4 executives of that company into federal prison alongside the rest of them. Among those 4 was a 68-year-old man named Warren Strauss Holcomb, the chairman of Harrington Coal's board, and a man who had been quietly building his empire across the southeastern United States for 30 years on the back of corporate dirty tricks no one had ever quite been able to prove. He would spend the rest of his life in federal custody. The trial took 14 months. Camilla Ashford Whitlock was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, and 7 other federal counts. She received life without the possibility of parole. She was 47 years old at sentencing. She wore a navy blue prison-issued jumpsuit. She did not look at Addie once during the entire proceeding. She did not look at her own son either. Camilla Ashford Whitlock had become by the end a woman who looked at nothing and no one, who simply waited with the patience of someone who had finally been freed from the burden of trying to want anything. Harrison Pemberton, age 63, was convicted of the same charges plus 3 additional counts of obstruction of justice and witness tampering. He received life without the possibility of parole. On the morning his sentence was read, the silver-haired lawyer who had once carried Addie on his shoulders at a 4th of July picnic finally turned and looked at her across the courtroom. Their eyes met for 2 long seconds. Then he looked down at the table in front of him, and he did not look up again. Bennett Ashford, age 23 at sentencing, was convicted on all counts. The judge, before reading the sentence, looked down at Bennett from the bench for a long moment and said on the record that in 31 years on the federal bench, he had never seen a case more shocking in its cold calculation, more disturbing in its patience, or more deserving of the maximum penalty the law allowed. He sentenced Bennett to life without the possibility of parole, to be served in a maximum security federal facility in Florence, Colorado. Bennett Ashford did not look at Adelaide Whitlock. As he was led from the courtroom, she looked at him. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel hatred. She felt mostly very tired. The cold coal that had been burning in her chest for 14 months had finally burned out, and what was left in its place was a quiet, steady warmth that she recognized after a moment as something her father had once tried to explain to her on the lake when she was 9 years old. He had called it peace. The year that followed was the year Adelaide Whitlock turned 20. She took control of Whitlock Logistics in a ceremony attended by 900 employees in the company's downtown Chicago headquarters. She wore a charcoal suit that had been her father's taken in by a tailor on Michigan Avenue. She wore his cufflinks, which were small silver lake perch fishing lures her mother had given him on his 30th birthday and which he had worn under his sleeves for 26 years. She wore her own shoes, practical low-heeled black. She gave a short speech. She said the company belonged to the people who worked there. She said the company would be run going forward by the values her father had built it on. She said she was 19 years old when her father had died, and that she was 20 years old today, and that she still did not know everything she would need to know, but that she had been raised by Theodore Whitlock, and that meant she would learn what she needed to learn the same way he had, by listening and by working, and by never lying about what she did not yet know. She said one more thing. She said that her father had spent 30 years building this company by treating his employees the way he treated his daughter. She said she had been the lucky one for 19 years, and that everyone in this room was going to be the lucky one for as many years as she had a hand on the wheel of this company. She said she did not know how long that would be. She said it would be at least as long as her father would have wanted. She received a standing ovation. It lasted 6 minutes. She founded the Theodore Whitlock Foundation in the spring. The foundation focused on 2 missions. The first was cardiac care for working-class families. The second was housing and dignity services for women living in their cars in the parking lots of suburban America. The foundation was endowed at $640 million. It was the largest single private commitment to the issue of female vehicular homelessness in the country. The foundation's first hire was a woman named Eleanor Thornberry. Miss Nellie was provided with a small brick house in a quiet neighborhood on the north side of Chicago and was installed as the foundation's senior community liaison. She did not retire. She did not slow down. She drove from Walmart to Walmart in a new gray Buick the foundation had purchased for her visiting parking lots, sitting at picnic tables drinking black McDonald's coffee with women who had no one to drink coffee with. She did this 5 days a week for the next 11 years until the day she died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 76 in the brick house with the small garden behind it. On the day of Miss Nellie's funeral, 300 women came to a small church on the north side of Chicago. None of them had known each other before Miss Nellie had walked over to their picnic tables. All of them had been off the streets for at least a year. 212 of them now had jobs. 47 of them had returned to school. One of them had become a nurse practitioner at a free clinic the foundation funded in Cicero. Adelaide Whitlock spoke at the funeral. She said the eulogy without notes. She said only that Eleanor Thornberry had been the first person to look at her in the dark, and that she would spend the rest of her life trying to look at other people the way Eleanor Thornberry had looked at her. The congregation cried for an hour after the service was over. Mabel Greaves was located by the Bureau in a small rented apartment outside Indianapolis. She had been hiding for 14 months. She was 48 years old and a widow, and she had lost everything when she refused the bribe Camilla had offered her, including her nursing license, her savings, and the small house she had been renting in Lake Forest. The foundation paid for her to complete her registered nursing degree at a school in Chicago. She graduated 2 years later. She came to work at a cardiac rehabilitation clinic that the foundation funded on the south side of the city, treating working-class patients who had no other access to specialized cardiac care. She testified at the federal trials. Her testimony alongside Dorian Creel's helped seal the convictions. She and Adelaide became close. They had Thanksgiving dinner together every year for the rest of Mabel's life, just the two of them in Mabel's small apartment near the clinic, with a turkey breast and mashed potatoes and the same green bean casserole Mabel's grandmother had made every November for 40 years. Wendell Pike was tracked down with some effort by Adelaide's personal assistant. He still lived in the same small ranch house outside Beloit, Wisconsin, where he had lived for the last 22 years. He still drove the Peterbilt. He had never accepted a dime from anyone for the favor he had done a bruised girl on the side of a county road on a cold morning in November. He had never told a soul about it. He had never spoken of it again, even to his wife of 34 years, a woman named Doreen, who had been a kindergarten teacher in Beloit for as long as Wendell had been on the road. Adelaide drove out to see him personally in a black GMC Yukon, driven by a bureau-trained personal security agent. She knocked on the front door of the small ranch house. Doreen Pike answered it. Wendell came out of the kitchen in his work boots and his red plaid shirt, and he looked at Addie standing on his porch in a tailored gray coat, and his face did not change. He just nodded once, the way he had nodded to her in the truck cab in the dark, and he stepped aside to let her in. She sat at his kitchen table for 3 hours. They drank coffee. Doreen baked a small batch of buttermilk biscuits. Addie told them everything. Wendell listened the way he had listened the first time, which was to say, without saying anything, with his face giving nothing away, with his hands folded around his coffee cup. When she was done, he asked one question. He asked if she had finished what she came to Chicago to do. She said she had. He said good. He said that was all that mattered. She asked him to come work for her. She told him about the foundation. She told him she needed a head of personal logistics, someone she trusted, someone who knew how the country worked from the inside of a truck cab. He thought about it for a long time. Doreen reached across the table and took his hand. He thought about it some more. He said yes. He retired the Peterbilt. He drove for her in a black GMC Yukon for the next 9 years until his own retirement at 69. He was, Adelaide would tell her own daughter, many years later, the second father she had been given by God in this life, and she had not deserved either of them, but had tried to be worthy of both. When Wendell Pike died at the age of 78 of a quiet heart attack in his own bed in the ranch house outside Beloit, Adelaide, Whitlock flew home from a business trip in London to attend the funeral. She stood beside Doreen Pike at the gravesite. She held the older woman's hand. She did not speak. She did not need to. She had nothing to say that Wendell Pike had not already heard her say 100 times in 100 quiet moments over the 9 years he had driven her. The house in Black River Falls was renovated. Adelaide had the white clapboard siding stripped and replaced. She had the porch rebuilt. She had the foundation repaired. She had the attic insulated and finished and converted into a long, sunlit, vaulted library with floor-to-ceiling oak bookshelves built into the side walls and a single overstuffed leather reading chair beside the small circular window in the front gable. The vault was left in place. It was never moved. She kept it locked with the silver key in a velvet pouch in the top drawer of her desk in Chicago. She came up to the house 3 or 4 times a year for long weekends. She came in the autumn, especially when the maples around the clearing turned the color of beaten copper. She brought her dog, a large rescued black Labrador named Pike, after the truck driver. She brought a stack of books. She brought sometimes the people who had become her family. Miss Nellie when Miss Nellie was still alive. Mabel. Wendell when Wendell was still alive. Agent B. Holloway, who had retired from the Bureau and had remained one of Adelaide's closest friends. In the renovated library on a long oak table by the window sat a small frame photograph. that Adelaide had found in the bottom of one of the cardboard boxes the bureau had recovered from the back corner of the attic on the day they had returned for the camcorder. The photograph was of Theodore Whitlock and his daughter, ages 40 and 3, sitting together on the back porch of the Lake Forest estate on a summer morning. Her father was holding a coffee cup. Adelaide was sitting on his knee in a pale yellow dress. A small gray and white chickadee was perched on her right shoulder, looking directly at the camera as if it had been called there for the picture. Theodore Whitlock was smiling. Adelaide had her arms around his neck. She did not remember the photograph being taken. She did not remember the dress. She remembered the bird. The green tackle box sat on the mantel above the fireplace in the renovated library. The false bottom had been left in place, empty. Now the cavity beneath it dusted clean. A small brass plaque had been mounted on the wall above the mantel. The plaque had 3 words engraved on it. They were her father's words, the last words she had ever heard him say on the small camera screen in the safe house bedroom in Chicago, the words she carried with her every day of her life from that day forward. The words were simply, "Look up, Birdie." Late on a quiet autumn evening, with the first cold wind of October beginning to move down out of the north and the maples just starting to give up the last of their gold, Adelaide Whitlock sat in the leather reading chair beside the small circular window in the front gable of her library, and she watched the moon rise over the pines of Black River Falls, and she thought about her father, and she thought about everything he had built for her, and she thought about the men and women he had asked her to take care of, and she thought about the company that bore his name and the foundation that bore his name and the small brass plaque above the mantel. The dogpike lay at her feet asleep, his big black ribs rising and falling slowly. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace below the mantel. She did not cry anymore when she thought about him. She just listened to the wind in the pines, and she felt the warmth of the fire on her face, and she watched the moon climb higher over the trees, and she understood in the deepest part of her that her father had not lost. He had not been killed in any way that mattered. He had reached down out of the dark with a green tackle box and a folded yellow letter and a small silver key, and he had pulled his 19-year-old daughter back up out of the cold rain of a Lake Forest porch, and he had set her on her own 2 feet, and he had told her in the last clear words he had on this earth to look up. She had looked up, and the world had been there waiting for her.